My name is William Locke. I'm Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, or CG as we like to call it. So I'm going to hand over now to Professor Claire Callender, who'll tell us a little bit more about the programme for today's conference.
Thank you, William. Well, we've got an exciting programme ahead of us, and details are provided in your pack. But basically this morning we've got a presentation by Lorraine Dearden, Jenny Case, and a panel talking about European HE. So the topics that we'll be covering this morning really act as a sort of backdrop to the overall CG research programme, insofar as they're cross-cutting themes that we'll all be picking up and we all bump into at some stage or other while we're talking and discussing and researching issues to do with higher education. And then after lunch, CG researchers will be presenting some of the initial findings of some of the studies. And then after refreshments, we all reconvene here and we will have a paper from Francis Green, looking at some of the early findings of his work on graduates. Now it's sort of my pleasure to introduce Simon Marginson, Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education. And he's going to say some opening words to the conference. Now, Simon's reputation absolutely goes before him. His prodigious contribution to higher education is absolutely unparalleled. And his levels of energy take me by surprise every single day. There isn't an hour of the day when an email doesn't arrive from Simon. And he is an academic with real flair and imagination, as witnessed and evidenced in his writings. And his commitment to CG, to making it work, to making sure that CG has an influence and impact and value to a globalized world of higher education, is similarly without doubt. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Simon.
Well, thank you, William and Claire. And colleagues, let's begin by congratulating Professor Claire Callender, who yesterday was awarded an OBE at the Palace in recognition of her contributions to higher education. It's wonderful, Claire. Colleagues, much has happened since the ESRC HEFCE Centre for Global Higher Education's founding conference at Senate House a year ago. And though much of the journey is still ahead, some of the distance has now been covered. I want to thank Deputy Directors Claire and William, Centre Manager Carolyn Gallup, Communications Officer Anna Phillips, the Research Management Committee, all the CG researchers, including our brilliant postdocs and doctoral students, CG's Advisory Board and associate organisations, and our funders, ESRC and HEFCE, who have been a great strength for us. And David Guile, Becky Francis, and Dame Nicola Brewer at UCL. And let me thank you all for joining CG today. Colleagues, we meet at a crucial time for UK, Europe, and higher education in an extraordinary landscape in the Atlantic countries in Western Europe that no one saw coming a year ago. Matters are different in East and Southeast Asia and Latin America, where education and science are rising, and in South Asia, Africa and the Middle East, which have more severe problems than us. But the world is interdependent, especially the higher education world, and changes in the Atlantic-Europe zone affect politics, economics and cross-border flows elsewhere. Higher education and research are directly implicated in these political developments. Higher education, science, experts, mobile foreigners and mobile locals all share a position of honour on the alt-right blacklist. Remarkably, the toxic, unresolvable debate between global mobility and national monoculture has not only paused the evolution of Europe, it's now more potent, so it seems, than the goal of economic prosperity, which a year ago ruled policy in the UK, US and elsewhere. We've long struggled with the domination of higher education policy by solely economic indicators, but we now have a larger problem, it seems. Ending free movement in Europe is now a higher priority for the UK government than either economic enrichment or attracting global talent. The UK's two most successful global sectors are financial services and higher education and research. Different though they are, each is likely to be collateral damage of blood and soil nationalist politics. Nigel Farage even argues that in trade agreements, the UK should give priority to countries that speak English. That's some export strategy. I doubt Germany is about to give priority to trading partners that speak German, or Finland to countries that only speak Finnish. And suddenly, higher education and research have been negatively positioned in both the UK and US. University cities in the Midlands and the North that voted Remain sit among strong Leave majorities in the smaller towns and rural areas for whom global connectedness is not working. And a rogue alt-right US administration targets both US universities and climate science. I think it's more dangerous in the United States. It all forces us to reconsider not just higher education, but our understandings of globalisation, society and politics, and even of determination in social science. The change in Anglo-America-Europe intersects with the higher education sector that's already undergoing transformation and has been for a generation or more. Three great tendencies have reshaped the sector: massification, globalisation and marketisation. Across the world, these three tendencies impact the sector in varied ways. Marketisation has transformed the English-speaking HE systems, Russia and much of Eastern Europe and India. It has had less impact in Western Europe and much of Latin America, has partly reversed in Poland, and has been contained in China and East Asia. Global convergence and integration have built a world system of knowledge based on networked universities, world-class universities, a fundamental and decisive change in human affairs. And there is a continuing secular expansion in mobility, global engagement, despite increasing opposition to migration in some countries, not all countries. But cross-border engagement is always articulated through national settings. The impact of the global varies markedly by country in higher education and in most other spheres. We now know you can be more or less global, and to some extent, it is still a matter of choice. Of the three tendencies, it's massification, linked to urbanisation and the growth of the middle classes everywhere, that's truly universal in higher education. In the last 2 decades, the world gross tertiary enrolment ratio jumped from 17 to 34%. It doubled. More than 50 countries enrol half of each school leaver age cohort, and some enrol 3/4 of the age cohort. Only in the United States and UK are student numbers falling. Perhaps this is because in these highly stratified systems, in societies becoming more unequal, the social value of participation in bottom-tier institutions is being emptied out, while private costs are rising. But overall, worldwide, the story is continuing and rapid growth in the ratio of the age group that enrolls in tertiary education, regardless of demographic patterns. So here's the new paradox of high participation higher education. On one hand, HE has never been so central to economic, social and cultural life, never reached more people, never been more socially inclusive. On the other hand, it's been, with some success, painted as a ruthless elite conspiracy. When Michael Gove said people have had enough of experts, that resonated with many that have never entered a university. When Theresa May said, if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, we felt the hurt, as if people must choose between singular mono-identities, national or global, and it's unnatural somehow to be both. I don't think we yet fully understand why higher education is now so central, and higher education and globalisation have become so closely intertwined. Perhaps our inherited social science tools are inadequate to this task. Human capital theory embodies an important insight into the way that higher education builds human capacity and potential, yet only part of that is captured by measures of productivity based in the market value of graduate labour. Likewise, series of credential signalling and positional competition can only provide us with part of the story of higher education's social role. And all are essentially proxies. How higher education does it remains a black box. Marginson, I think, comes closer with his focus on capability. Studies of teaching and learning that identify the effects of immersion in complex knowledge, like the CGHE study being conducted by Paul, Jan and Yanya, also points the way. The key, I think, and herein lies the lasting democratic potential of our sector, is higher education's role in fostering student agency, graduate agency, people's agency. Higher education changes people, that we know. It builds capacity and confidence so that graduates are less trapped by their personal circumstances. As Sen notes, building agency also has an associational dimension as well as an individual one. Higher learning fosters collective social agency and global agency. Shanghai Academic Ranking of World Universities has called this year for a conference on world-class university, a global common good and national contributor. Higher education is one of the building blocks of a future global society. Let me give you an illustration. Recently, the OECD published Perspectives on Global Development 2017, International Migration in a Shifting World. It contains a table comparing the cross-border mobility of people with and without university degrees. Amongst those without university degrees, the tendency to move across borders is correlated to income. As you might expect, as income rises, people have more scope for mobility, and they are more mobile. The capacity for mobility is associated with economic advantage, and it furthers those individual economic advantages. The wealthy benefit more from globalisation. End of story. No, it isn't. Amongst those with university degrees, and current participation rates suggest that soon that'll be 1/5 of the world's population, the pattern is different. First, at a given level of income, those with degrees are much more mobile than those without degrees. In other words, higher education helps to democratise mobility, though only provided you can get into higher education in the first place. Second, for those with degrees, as income rises, once a modest threshold of income is reached, there's little change in potential mobility. My conclusion is that higher education not only helps graduates achieve greater personal agency, it actually reduces the effects of economic determination in their life circumstances. Whoa! Education in itself brings graduates greater freedom. We don't have to read it through proxies or indirect effects. And this effect is not fully captured in graduate salaries and employment rates, but it's profoundly important. That's what I mean about rethinking our core assumptions. This conjunction of higher education, mobility, and agency freedom also helps to explain why educated persons and experts and mobile and cosmopolitan persons have joint targets of the alt-right. Though economic inequality and social closure have provided fertile conditions for the backlash, the political polarisations engineered by UKIP and by Donald Trump do not turn fundamentally on income or class. There are poor and wealthy on both sides of these divides. These political polarisations turn largely on culture, and higher education is part of that cultural mix. We gained some sense of this from the voting patterns in the June referendum on Brexit and the November American election. And now, a word of caution. Binary voting calls up heterogeneous voting blocs. By no means all Brexit supporters are persuaded by alt-right arguments. Some are left of centre, including many in Labor Party branches. In the US, Trump draws on the votes of many lifelong Republicans who support the party of Lincoln and are not particularly enamoured of the alt-right. And the polarisation also partly differs between the US and the UK cases, with ethnicity, or in the American language, race and gender playing a larger role in the US. But the momentum of both Brexit and Trump was driven by the alt-right, inescapably. And there was convergence in the arguments between the countries, particularly on migration, national identity, and the negative referencing of experts. The argument, give us our country back, was the argument in both countries. The best overall predictors of how people voted were, 1, whether they lived in large cities, whether they voted Remain, where they voted Remain and Clinton, or they lived in small towns and rural areas where they voted for Leave and for Trump in great numbers. And then secondly, whether they had a degree. Degree holders concentrate in cities. In the UK, just 26% of degree holders voted Leave, but 78% of those without qualifications. Young people, the most educated generation in UK history, overwhelmingly voted Remain. In the US, Trump celebrated the uneducated famously during his campaign, and he secured a sharp swing amongst those who have never attended college. Clinton secured more than half the vote from only one group of white voters. They were college-educated women. It's ironic, isn't it? Once high participation, higher education, and also climate science become more central to human affairs, they can be used to polarise an electorate on the basis of identity. You can't divide an electorate when only 5% of people go to university. When 30 or 40% go to university, it's a different matter. But while mass higher education is more politically vulnerable, there is also a positive side. Because higher education changes people, because graduates have a greater capacity to manage difference, change and complexity, and are more comfortable with mobility and plural cultures, the continuing spread of higher education will undercut the ground from under the alt-right, provided that higher education remains sufficiently equitable to continue to attract first-generation students, newly participating families, and sufficiently attuned to the communities in which universities and colleges are nested. In countries like ours, where market forces have let rip, we need to moderate stratification, strengthen the quality and standing of mass higher education institutions, and focus on public goods as well as private benefits of higher education. Undue emphasis on private goods and on selective HEIs inaccessible to the average family means higher education is more readily isolated. But if they adopt an inclusive approach, not just in access but in mission, HEIs can do much to reconcile the global and the local and rebuild social solidarity in fractured societies. These are the larger issues underlying CG's 15 research projects being pursued by 40 researchers in 5 UK and 8 international universities. CG was created to be the eye of the storm as a research-based reflexive capacity in UK higher education and higher education policy. In establishing CG, ESRC and HEFCE saw the need for that reflexive capacity to operate on a global scale and a globally collaborative basis, so that HE could be seen from outside the UK as well as within, while remaining rooted here. This perspective, this dual perspective, inside and outside, global, national, local, is diametrically opposed to the nation-bounded blood and soil vision of UKIP and Trump. But the healthy development of UK higher education is also part of our remit, central to CG. And this means HE in the context of Brexit. We have sought ESRC funding to study the consequences and potentials of Brexit for UK institutions, including their strategic capacity in a fast-changing setting characterised by great uncertainty, multiple possibilities, sudden shocks and problems of staffing and financial sustainability. We've also begun a small network project bringing researchers of higher education in Europe together to explore the Brexit environment as it affects European higher education as well as higher education in the UK. Since the last public conference, we've opened our centre premises in the UCL Institute of Education building in Bedford Way. We've started 6 new researchers, including 2 doctoral students, and kick-started most of the CG projects, mostly in the second half of last year, 2016. Lancaster and Sheffield have held their first CG events, and our international partners in Netherlands, South Africa, Australia, Hong Kong SAR, Japan and China have started their work. A dozen CG working papers were released last year, and we mounted 35 public seminars, including large gatherings on the REF and on higher education and the media. Our researchers have produced many blogs and have been media active, especially in the Times Higher Education. We sincerely thank John Gill and his team. This year we broadened the CG agenda in several ways. In association with the British Council, we've started work in India, and we are soon to go to Mexico and Chile. We have begun a 2 to 4 page CG policy brief series that we hope will both augment our impact as researchers and provide a medium for disseminating project outcomes. April, with funding from Lancaster University, will see the first CG key debate in higher education with the title, What is Global About Global Higher Education? In June, with funding from UCL IOE, we hold a summer school for CG postdocs and doctoral students, including our overseas-based researchers. Today's conference has 3 purposes. First, to discuss the cross-cutting themes and events in worldwide higher education, as Claire mentioned, including the keynotes from Lorraine and Jenny this morning and the panel session on Brexit, Europe and UK. Second, to present findings from our research. Most of our projects are 3 to 4 years. The main outputs and their impact will fall in the second half of the project cycle. Nevertheless, today we released some early findings from 5 projects, including research on the graduate labour market, which will be presented in the final conference keynote by Francis this afternoon, and studies of cooperation between UKHE and industry, and you'll see a CG working paper on that topic in front of you. Higher education governance in the UK and Europe, the parameters of student loans policy, long-term relation between macroeconomic changes and higher education funding and participation. Most of these early project findings will be presented in the parallel sessions, as Claire mentioned. The third purpose of the conference is to hear from you. Today will be a success to the extent that you become involved, not only those in the hall, but those accessing the conference through the live stream. Respond to the papers, give us your take on the key issues, and tell us what CG should or could do. After the conference, as Claire said, the papers, as William said actually, the papers and slides will be available on the CG website. And we hope to see and hear from you after the conference, in CG seminars and our other activities. Again, thank you very much for coming. We look forward to a fascinating day and one we hope will take us all forward. Thanks.